usually, when a global superpower goes to war, the blueprint presented to the public is it's incredibly sterile.
Oh, yeah, highly sanitized.
Right, like it's presented as this clean, jagged white line on an intelligence map. The administration comes out, they point to a clear violation of international law, they highlight some specific strategic objective, and they assure us the machinery of the state is moving with, surgical precision.
Right. Surgical, that's always the buzzword.
Exactly. But today, if you look at the actual reality of the situation on the ground, that map is effectively burning. I mean, the diagnostic machinery is just broken. We have officially reached a pivotal moment in global history.
We really have.
It is day 21 of the U.S.-Iran war. And the Strait of Hormuz, which is the single most critical maritime choke point for the entire global energy supply, is functionally closed.
Completely choked off, yeah.
And because of that, the global energy market is currently staring down the barrel of an absolute Armageddon scenario. And, as if the external pressures weren't enough, we have just witnessed the absolute highest-ranking resignation of a U.S. official over a military conflict since the Vietnam era.
It's staggering. I mean, the tectonic plates of the post-Cold War global order are quite literally shifting beneath our feet right now. And the administration is just, they're struggling to keep their balance. We are looking at a masterclass in diagnostic muddy waters here. The stated objectives of the conflict are completely misaligned with the tactical and economic realities that are actually unfolding.
Welcome to the Hot News Channel, where we strip away the noise to analyze today's breaking stories. It is Saturday, March 21, 2026.
And our mission for today's deep dive is, well, it's exhaustive and critical. We are synthesizing a massive, just unprecedented stack of intelligence reports, financial analyses, and geopolitical briefings to uncover the hidden truth that the mainstream broadcasts are honestly just glossing over right now.
Yeah, they are.
We are going to examine exactly how military hubris is violently colliding with raw economic reality. And the shockwaves from this collision, they're not just rewriting the map of the Middle East. They are fundamentally rewriting the United States Constitution and the entire global economic order.
Right. And for you listening right now, I want to be clear, this isn't just some, abstract foreign policy seminar.
No, not at all.
Whether you are feeling that intense visceral pinch at the gas pump this morning, or you're watching your retirement accounts and the broader financial market swing wildly out of control, the hard data we are about to unpack explains exactly why your daily life is being disrupted.
Exactly why.
And more importantly, we're going to map out the underlying mechanics of this crisis so you know exactly where the dominoes are going to fall next.
Because the effects of this conflict have violently breached the containment of the Middle East. They are bleeding into the supply chains, the inflation indices, and the domestic political stability of every single Western nation.
Yeah. So we have to start by examining the shattered consensus in Washington. Let's look at the unprecedented resignation of the Director of Counterterrorism, Joe Kent. I mean, this is a massive earthquake within the intelligence community.
A seismic event.
He is the highest-ranking official to step down in protest over a war since Vietnam. And his stated reasons were not buried in polite bureaucratic speak either.
No, he was incredibly blunt.
He explicitly accused Israel of being responsible for instigating the war. And he stated on the public record, mind you, that there is absolutely zero U.S. strategic interest in this conflict.
Right. And the gravity of that resignation, it just cannot be overstated when you look at his background. I mean, Joe Kent is not a pacifist.
No.
He isn't someone who shies away from the kinetic realities of military action. He joined the military at 17. He became an Army Ranger, served in the elite 75th Ranger Regiment, and deployed multiple times to combat zones.
Oh.
Furthermore, his own wife, who was a cryptologic linguist, was tragically killed in action in Syria. So when a man with that specific combat-hardened background, occupying one of the most sensitive, highly classified counterterrorism roles in the nation, steps away from his post and states that the current war is devoid of American strategic interest.
Yeah.
And is entirely the machination of a foreign allied power, it shatters the entire foundational narrative used to justify the deployment of troops.
It really does.
Yeah.
And the timeline of his resignation is, I think, the key to unlocking just how fractured that narrative actually is. Because right around the exact same time Kent steps down, we have the congressional testimony of Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard and John Ratcliffe.
Oh, no, this was wild.
It was. In an open broadcast hearing, Gabbard claimed to Senator John Ossoff that Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated by airstrikes last June.
Obliterated, that was the word she used.
Right. She explicitly stated they made absolutely no effort to rebuild that infrastructure, yet in the very same breath, she still classified the nation as an imminent threat.
Which is just a massive logical contradiction.
Exactly. But then Ratcliffe directly contradicted her in the same forum, stating that Iran was actively developing nuclear weapons.
Right. And the structural breakdown happening here is catastrophic. If you look at the analysis by Larry Johnson and Ray McGovern, we are witnessing a complete fracture in the legal justification for a massive multi-theater war.
Yeah.
When the absolute highest echelons of the intelligence community contradict themselves and each other in open congressional hearings, it points to a systemic failure of consensus. Johnson and McGovern point out that Gabbard's testimony might legally border on perjury.
Well, let's break down the mechanics of why that actually borders on perjury. Because the Director of National Intelligence isn't just like an advisory role. The office, which was created in the wake of the 9/11 Commission report, is statutorily required to define what constitutes an imminent threat to the United States.
Exactly.
That is the core legal mandate of the position.
Precisely. The DNI synthesizes the findings of all 17 intelligence agencies to provide a unified threat assessment to lawmakers. But during this hearing, she attempted to punt that responsibility entirely to the Oval Office. She claimed it is solely the president's job to determine what is and isn't a threat.
Wow.
Yeah, she effectively abdicated the core legal responsibility of her office to avoid reconciling a massive logical contradiction. I mean, an obliterated nuclear program that hasn't been rebuilt cannot, by the laws of physics or international relations, pose an imminent nuclear threat.
Right. So we're looking at an intelligence apparatus that is trying to retroactively fit a threat narrative to a war that was launched for entirely different geopolitical reasons.
Yeah.
You know, we talk about historical parallels a lot, and this feels so much like the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Oh, absolutely.
Like the supposed unprovoked attack on U.S. ships that escalated the Vietnam War, which we later learned was based on highly manipulated intelligence. But the difference here is that this Gulf of Tonkin is happening in real time in the digital age.
That is the crucial distinction. In 1964, the administration could easily control the flow of information to the public and to Congress. In 2026, there are simply too many competing informational vectors.
Right.
The architects of this narrative cannot keep their stories straight because open source intelligence, independent analysis, and internal leaks are constantly challenging their assertions.
And those internal leaks are painting a terrifying picture of the morale of the people actually fighting this war. We have hard data regarding highly suspicious incidents within the fleet, most notably a 30-hour fire in the laundry room of a U.S. aircraft carrier.
30 hours?
Yeah. Now, let's think about the mechanics of damage control in a multi-billion-dollar supercarrier for a second. These vessels, whether they're Nimitz class or Ford class, are essentially floating cities, and they are equipped with the most advanced aqueous film-forming foam, or AFFF, fire suppression systems on the planet.
Top of the line.
Right. Their damage control teams are trained to extinguish massive aviation fuel fires from missile strikes in a fraction of that time. So a 30-hour fire over lint in a laundry room completely defines the operational realities of naval damage control.
It strains credulity to the absolute breaking point. The logical extension of that anomaly is that this was not an accident. We have to seriously consider the theory that this is an act of civil disobedience or outright sabotage by enlisted sailors.
Which means the crisis of conscience isn't just happening at the top with Joe Kent. If the rank-and-file sailors, the ones actually turning the wrenches, stuffing the washing machines, and working the lower decks, if they recognize the same lack of strategic justification that the Director of Counterterrorism recognized, you inevitably start seeing passive or active resistance.
Definitely.
I mean, these enlisted men and women have smartphones. They read the news. When they see their intelligence directors blatantly contradicting each other about why they are deployed in a hostile combat zone, the operational readiness of the fleet begins to degrade from the inside out.
A military force is ultimately bound by a shared belief in the mission. When the justification for the mission is exposed as contradictory or fabricated, the chain of command begins to fray. And that internal fraying is happening precisely when the tactical requirements of this conflict are demanding more resources than ever before.
Which brings us to the raw, tactical, and financial realities of this war, because the numbers we are seeing are just staggering. The Department of War has just submitted a massive $200 billion supplemental funding request to the White House simply to sustain this conflict.
$200 billion. just to sustain it.
Yeah. And simultaneously, the U.S. military is deploying 2,500 Marines and sailors alongside the USS Boxer, which is a massive amphibious assault ship, straight into the region.
That $200 billion figure is the death knell for the initial operating assumption of this conflict. The prevailing belief in Washington was that this would be a quick, surgical war, a few targeted strikes, and it would be over. Requesting $200 billion in supplemental funding signals that the Pentagon has completely abandoned that assumption. They are now actively preparing for a protracted, grueling, multi-domain war of attrition.
And the tactical proposals being floated are getting more extreme by the day.
Yeah.
According to Axios reporting, President Trump is actively mulling a ground invasion of Kharg Island. Now, for context, Kharg Island sits about 15 miles off the Iranian coast in the Persian Gulf.
Right.
It is the absolute beating heart of their energy economy, processing roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. And to add fuel to the diplomatic fire, Trump took to Truth Social and publicly called NATO allies a paper tiger and cowards for refusing to join a joint military operation to aggressively force open the Strait of Hormuz.
The concept of invading Kharg Island perfectly illustrates what Alexander Mercouris details in his analysis as hegemonic hubris. The deeply flawed assumption in Washington think tanks was that Iran's government was a fragile house of cards. The theory was that applying maximum kinetic pressure to their economic center of gravity would cause the entire regime to collapse inward, allowing the U.S. to install a friendly government and declare a swift, bloodless victory.
But the physical mechanics of that strategy make absolutely no sense. Let's say we deploy the USS Boxer. We put 2,500 highly trained Marines on the beaches of Kharg Island and take control of the oil terminals. We haven't actually opened the Strait of Hormuz. We've just parked our troops on a stationary, highly explosive petrochemical target.
Exactly.
We aren't securing the shipping lanes. We're essentially giving the adversary a multi-billion-dollar hostage.
Your assessment of the physical mechanics is entirely accurate. The Strait of Hormuz is a geographic choke point. To keep it closed, Iran does not need blue water naval supremacy. They rely on an anti-access area denial doctrine, or A2AD.
Right, A2AD.
This involves highly decentralized, mobile anti-ship missile batteries, often referred to as missile cities, that are deeply buried in the rugged, mountainous terrain along the coastline. These systems use passive radar and optical tracking, making them incredibly difficult to detect from the air. If the U.S. occupies Kharg Island, they place 2,500 Marines within point-blank range of thousands of these decentralized missile systems. It is a tactical dead end.
I want to push back on the vulnerability aspect for a second, just to play devil's advocate here. The U.S. isn't just sailing into this blind and naked. They are actively building a massive defensive architecture in the region. We're looking at specific expedited arms sales, $16.5 billion, with some estimates reaching up to $23 billion going directly to the UAE, Kuwait, and Jordan.
Right, massive sales.
We were talking about advanced F-16 fighter jets, early warning radar, and the Patriot PACE-3 systems, which are our most advanced hit-to-kill ballistic missile interceptors. It seems like the strategy is to build an impenetrable, high-tech fortress around our Gulf allies.
The flaw in that strategy becomes incredibly apparent when you study the logistics of modern warfare. A fortress is fundamentally useless if its supply lines are cut.
How true.
You can deploy a $23 billion shield of Patriot PACE-3 batteries, but those interceptors require massive amounts of diesel fuel to run their radar generators. They require constant shipments of spare parts. The F-16s require specialized aviation fuel.
Right.
If the maritime traffic carrying those essential components cannot safely pass through the Strait of Hormuz, the fortress starves from the inside.
It's like installing a state-of-the-art, multi-million-dollar home security system in a house that has just had its water and electricity permanently shut off from the outside. The alarms and the cameras might work perfectly, but the inhabitants inside are still going to starve to death.
That is the exact thermodynamic and logistical reality, and the supposed invulnerability of U.S. military assets has already been starkly disproven by the data. We've confirmed reports that a U.S. aircraft carrier strike group literally fled to the southern Indian Ocean after a test launch of just 4 Iranian ballistic missiles.
4 missiles, not a massive barrage, just 4.
Just a test. But if the mere launch of 4 missiles forces a multi-billion-dollar carrier strike group, which is the crown jewel of U.S. naval power projection, to reposition hundreds of miles away to stay out of range, it proves that the anti-access capabilities of the adversary are highly effective.
Right.
The carrier can no longer operate with impunity in the Persian Gulf. Furthermore, we have the paradigm-shifting reports of an F-35 being shot down.
That detail is critical because the F-35 Lightning II is supposed to be the absolute pinnacle of fifth-generation stealth technology. The entire marketing pitch for that aircraft is its radar cross-section. It's designed to be virtually undetectable to enemy air defenses.
The loss of an F-35 shatters the foundational myth of U.S. technological invincibility. It completely rewrites the risk calculus for every commander in the theater.
Plus,
Well, whether the aircraft was tracked by low-frequency radar, which can sometimes detect the general vicinity of stealth aircraft, or engaged via optical and infrared tracking systems used by these decentralized militias, the result is exactly the same. If the most advanced, expensive stealth aircraft in human history can be acquired and neutralized by regional defense networks, then absolutely no asset in the region is safe.
right.
Not the carriers, not the amphibious assault ships, and certainly not the oil tankers.
And that destruction of the F-35 doesn't just shatter our military mythos either. It immediately shatters the financial markets. Because the moment that plane goes down and the moment a carrier retreats, the physical supply shock of a closed Strait of Hormuz becomes a permanent reality. Let's look at the hard data on domestic gas prices here.
Yeah, let's look at the numbers.
At his February 24th State of the Union address, which was just 4 days before this war officially started, President Trump cited a domestic gas price of $1.99 per gallon. Today, we are looking at a national average of $3.91 and an eye-watering $4.89 in places like Hawaii.
That staggering price increase is the direct causal result of the military escalation and the failure to secure the maritime supply lines. The global energy infrastructure is taking catastrophic damage.
Let's talk about the mechanics of that damage. Look at Qatar. The Ras Laffan gas facility was hit. The CEO of Qatar Gas confirmed $20 billion in damages to a facility that was literally just completed 2 years ago.
$20 billion, just gone.
Yeah. Now, for the listener, an LNG liquefied natural gas facility isn't just like a big tank of gas. It is an incredibly complex thermodynamic processing plant. You have liquefaction trains and massive cryogenic heat exchangers that cool the gas down to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit. If a missile hits that infrastructure, you don't just patch a hole. You have to rebuild custom-engineered cryogenic technology, which takes years.
The destruction of Ras Laffan represents a massive excision of future energy supply from the global grid. And the financial extortion surrounding this protection is mind-boggling.
Extortion is the right word for it.
According to the analysis by Omani journalist Salem Al-Johari, the United States has demanded an extortionate $5 trillion from the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC states, which include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, simply to sustain the military umbrella for this war.
Wow.
Alternatively, the U.S. has demanded $2.5 trillion from them just to stop the conflict.
$5 trillion. I mean, that isn't a strategic partnership. That is a mob shakedown on a geopolitical scale. And it shows how utterly desperate the financial situation has become.
It really does.
To contextualize that desperation, look at the panic recommendations just issued by the International Energy Agency, the IEA. They are officially recommending mandated remote work, reducing highway speed limits globally by 10 kilometers per hour, and cutting air travel to reduce jet fuel demand by 15%.
What you are describing is wartime rationing. They are simply refusing to call it rationing to avoid a complete public panic.
Exactly. Yet while the IEA is preparing for a global energy famine, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been touring the financial networks claiming the exact opposite. He's claiming the Iranian regime is in a state of total economic collapse, that the U.S. is successfully freezing their leadership's bank accounts, and that a mass defection is imminent.
Right.
But the hard economic data from the markets shows that absolutely nobody with real money actually believes him.
The institutional financial markets are actively hedging against the U.S. dollar right now. We can look at the data from Lear Capital and Morgan Stanley. Gold is currently projected to hit anywhere from $5,000 to $6,000 an ounce. Silver is pushing aggressively toward $150 an ounce.
That's incredible.
But the most telling data point is that Morgan Stanley has fundamentally shifted the traditional 60-40 investment portfolio. For decades, the gold standard for institutional wealth management has been 60% equities and 40% bonds. they have now moved to a 60-20-20 model, advising their clients to place a massive 20% of their entire portfolio directly into physical precious metals.
The logical extension of a major institutional bank advising a 20% allocation into physical metals is that they foresee severe structural inflation and a massive devaluation of fiat currency caused by an enduring energy shock. But then you have voices like Steve Eisman, the investor famously portrayed in the book and movie The Big Short. He recently went on CNBC and explicitly told investors to ignore the geopolitical noise, claiming this war is actually a long-term positive for the markets. How does someone who famously predicted the 2008 housing collapse justify that kind of optimism in the face of an energy crisis?
Eisman's view represents a deeply entrenched, deeply flawed Wall Street illusion. It is the belief that every single geopolitical crisis, no matter how physical, can eventually be financialized, securitized, and traded for a profit. He is analyzing this entirely through the lens of monetary policy, assuming the Federal Reserve can simply adjust interest rates to smooth over the disruption.
But you can't print a barrel of oil. You can't adjust interest rates to magically fix a destroyed cryogenic heat exchanger at Ras Laffan.
Exactly. Eisman is completely ignoring the thermodynamic reality that our entire globally integrated economy requires a continuous baseline of cheap, abundant energy to function. The destruction of physical infrastructure, like the $20 billion Ras Laffan facility or the South Pars gas field, creates an absolute physical supply shock. You cannot quantitative ease a destroyed refinery back into existence. When the energy grid fails, the financial derivatives built on top of it collapse.
Which perfectly explains the wild, almost comical geopolitical irony we are seeing right now. The U.S. administration is reportedly so desperate to lower domestic oil prices ahead of the upcoming election cycle that they are secretly easing sanctions on Russian oil.
Right.
At the exact same time, the U.S. is engaged in a massive proxy war with Russia over Ukraine. We are quietly lifting the embargo on their energy exports just to keep the lights on and the gas pumps flowing at home.
It's pure desperation.
It is. Meanwhile, NATO forces are entirely withdrawing from Iraq, and the Iraqi government has officially declared force majeure on all of its oil fields, meaning they were legally declaring an inability to fulfill any of their international supply contracts due to unforeseeable circumstances.
The post-Cold War consensus is unraveling in real time. As the conventional kinetic war stalls out in the Persian Gulf and the economic war backfires on the West, we are seeing the emergence of a bizarre, highly disturbing shadow war.
Let's dive into the mechanics of that shadow war, because this is where the environmental and intelligence data gets incredibly strange. We need to talk about the weather manipulation allegations.
Oh, yes.
According to the data analysis by Dane Wigington, Iran experienced an unprecedented 89% decrease in rainfall in 2025.
89%.
Yeah. The claim being made is that this is not a natural climate anomaly, but the direct result of advanced geoengineering and weather manipulation by Western powers designed to induce an artificial drought and completely cripple Iran's agricultural sector. And adding fuel to this, there are reports that Vice President Kamala Harris allegedly receives highly classified intelligence briefings specifically on the tracking of climate engineering.
This is a complex vector to analyze because it sits right on the boundary between science fiction, classified military capability, and psychological warfare.
I want to be very clear here for you listening. I'm bringing up this weather data strictly as a factual, statistical anomaly present in the environmental records. A country doesn't naturally lose 89% of its rainfall year over year without massive atmospheric shifts.
Right.
But immediately, you have mainstream financial outlets like Forbes magazine rushing to publish pieces, aggressively dismissing it as a stolen clouds conspiracy theory. They aren't debating the meteorological science. They're just trying to shut down the conversation entirely.
The immediate dismissiveness by mainstream outlets requires pushback. Regardless of where you personally stand on the technical feasibility of atmospheric manipulation, whether we are talking about large-scale silver iodide cloud seeding or HARP-style ionospheric heating, we must look at the long, heavily documented historical precedent of covert warfare.
Yeah.
The military-industrial complex has always sought asymmetric advantages. We know the CIA has engaged in highly classified, completely deniable operations for decades. We've seen clandestine activities hinted at in the recent Navy SEAL investigations brought forward by investigative journalists like Matt. The intelligence apparatus is entirely capable of utilizing environmental factors as a weapon.
So the real debate we should be having isn't just about whether we are literally drying out their reservoirs with technology. The debate is whether this is a genuine tactical vector, a physical weaponization of the weather, or if it is a highly sophisticated informational psychological operation. If you can convince an adversary's population that your military is so omnipotent that you control the rain, you induce mass panic and turn the populace against their own government for failing to provide water.
It functions as a weapon of mass instability either way. And the psychological shadow war is running parallel to very real, very kinetic, covert actions. We are seeing a coordinated wave of assassinations targeting top Iranian figures, including the high-profile elimination of the IRGC spokesman, Ali Naini.
Right.
The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is the ideological and military core of the Iranian state, so assassinating their spokesman is a massive escalation in the shadow war.
And it isn't just assassinations. We also have the direct Israeli strikes against the Caspian Sea port of Nur. Now, geography is really important here. The Caspian Sea is way up north. It is entirely disconnected from the Persian Gulf theater.
A completely different zone.
Yeah. And those specific strikes prompted furious, formal complaints from the Russian Foreign Ministry. They explicitly stated that attacking the port of Nur poses a direct, unacceptable threat to the shared littoral state infrastructure of the Caspian Basin. For you listening, littoral just refers to the coastal regions. Russia considers the Caspian Sea its secure backyard, and striking ports there threatens the complex web of trade and naval infrastructure shared by Russia, Iran, and other bordering states.
The strikes in the Caspian Sea illuminate the broader, much more dangerous geopolitical alignment forming beneath the surface of this conflict. According to the detailed strategic analysis by Alistair Crook and Alexander Mercouris, China and Russia are playing a highly calculated, incredibly patient game.
They are playing a proxy game, right?
Yeah.
Because neither Beijing nor Moscow is sending actual combat troops to fight alongside Iran.
That is the core of their strategy. They are providing just enough logistical and economic support to keep Iran fighting. We are seeing intelligence reports of massive, continuous truck convoys moving essential goods, fuel, and dual-use military components from Tajikistan straight across the border into Iran.
Wow.
Russia and China are utilizing Iran to bleed the United States military and its financial reserves dry without ever directly entering the crosshairs of the conflict themselves.
It is the ultimate strategic trap. They are letting the U.S. exhaust its $200 billion supplemental budgets. They are watching the U.S. deplete its finite stockpile of Patriot Pass-3 interceptors, which cost millions of dollars per missile, intercepting cheap, mass-produced drones.
Right.
While the U.S. drains its resources in the Middle East, Russia and China sit back, observe the vulnerabilities of American stealth technology and naval doctrine, and consolidate their own regional power.
The United States is effectively fighting a multi-front proxy war, but they're the ones bogged down in the direct kinetic fighting, absorbing the immense financial and reputational damage.
And speaking of absorbing damage, let's bring the focus of this deep dive back home. Because the foreign policy crisis we've just outlined is triggering a massive, unprecedented constitutional crisis right here in the United States.
The friction between the executive branch and the legislative branch is reaching a historical boiling point.
According to the analysis by David Sirota on his Investigative Master Plan series, the executive branch has aggressively utilized the unitary executive theory to bypass congressional war powers entirely. The administration is committing the nation to a massive $200 billion conflict without a formal declaration of war, without a sustained legislative debate, and without the consent of Congress.
Right.
They're acting effectively like a monarchy.
We have to analyze the philosophical depths of this constitutional friction impartially, because we are watching a collision of two very distinct views on how a republic should operate in a crisis. The unitary executive theory isn't new. It gained massive traction during the Nixon and Bush administrations.
Yeah, we've seen this before.
From the right-wing perspective, the argument is that an empowered unitary executive is absolutely necessary to cut through a bloated, unelected, and actively hostile federal bureaucracy, often termed the deep state. Proponents argue that the modern world moves too fast and the threats are too immediate for endless partisan congressional deliberation. They believe the president must have the unilateral authority to swiftly enact the mandate given to him by the voters, both militarily and domestically.
But then you have the left-wing perspective, which argues that bypassing Article 1 of the Constitution, which grants Congress the sole power to declare war and control the budget, is a direct existential threat to the republic itself. From this viewpoint, allowing an executive to unilaterally launch a $200 billion war of choice overseas while simultaneously utilizing that same unchecked authority to threaten sweeping domestic crackdowns at home violates the core separation of powers designed by the founders to prevent tyranny.
And this philosophical tension is manifesting in tangible, highly controversial domestic policy right now. The administration has heavily championed aggressive mass deportation efforts and legislation like the SAVE Act, utilizing the massive apparatus of the federal government to enforce internal security.
But here is where the data shows a critical, unexpected pivot. According to reporting by the Wall Street Journal, Donald Trump has suddenly signaled a pause, or at least a significant reduction in these mass deportation operations. And the Journal explicitly cited that he is taking this advice directly from inner circle members, and specifically from Melania Trump, who are warning that the political optics of these operations are becoming disastrous for the administration's stability.
This pivot did not happen in a vacuum, though. It comes directly on the heels of massive, sustained, and highly disruptive public protests paralyzing major cities, Chicago, Los Angeles, Minneapolis. Furthermore, we are seeing the aggressive mobilization of the upcoming No Kings rallies, heavily promoted by Representative Eric Swalwell, which are designed to directly challenge the concept of the unitary executive in the public square.
So if we look at the mechanics of public pressure, it creates a fascinating dynamic. The protests and the sheer visibility of the domestic operations successfully forced a tangible policy pivot. The administration looked at the unrest over deportations, listened to the inner circle, and they blinked.
The logical extension of that observation, however, highlights a glaring contradiction. If sustained public pressure and protests work so effectively on domestic policy, forcing an executive pivot, why hasn't that same public pressure worked to stop the $200 billion war in Iran?
That is the million-dollar question. Why the disconnect? Why do people riot over domestic policy but remain relatively passive while the intelligence community legally fractures itself to justify a Middle Eastern war?
It comes down to the psychology of how voters perceive pain. Historically, foreign policy is incredibly abstract to the average citizen. A drone strike 7,000 miles away or an amphibious assault ship deploying to the Persian Gulf doesn't immediately change how you live your life. It doesn't empty your bank account that day.
Right.
Whereas seeing federal agents conducting deportations in your own neighborhood is visceral, immediate, and highly emotional.
But the data we've unpacked today shows that isolation is completely gone. The buffer between foreign policy and domestic reality has evaporated because $4.89 for a gallon of gas is making the war a domestic issue. The structural inflation, the 20% drop in your 401k because Morgan Stanley is fleeing to gold, the very real threat to the purchasing power of the US dollar, the economic blowback from the closed Strait of Hormuz is translating abstract foreign policy into brutal kitchen table economic pain.
It absolutely is.
And that pain leads to the ultimate leverage left in this constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
The power of the purse. Congress's only remaining constitutional mechanism to stop the unitary executive from pursuing this conflict is to explicitly defund the $200 billion supplemental request.
The mechanism exists, but utilizing it requires a level of political courage that we simply haven't seen yet. To defund the war, members of Congress have to overcome the intense, career-ending fear of being politically branded as anti-military, weak on terror, or abandoning the troops during a highly polarized election cycle. The executive branch knows this paralyzing fear exists, which is exactly why they are daring Congress to vote against the funding. They are betting that the legislature will fold.
So we are at a total impasse, both militarily in the Gulf and constitutionally in Washington. Let's bring this all together for the ultimate takeaway. If there is one single undeniable reality you must remember from this week's deep dive, it is this. The era of uncontested unipolar superpower dominance is definitively over.
It's done.
The United States military and financial apparatus is learning a very brutal, incredibly expensive lesson in the limits of force. It turns out that a $35,000 drone and a highly decentralized network of regional militias can effectively paralyze a globally integrated economic system. They can functionally freeze multi-billion-dollar aircraft carriers and advanced stealth fighters right in their tracks. The old geopolitical playbook isn't just outdated, it is actively burning.
The playbook is burning, and the structural vulnerabilities of the West have been laid bare. I want to leave you with a final, lingering, provocative thought to mull over as you watch the markets this week. Ayatollah Mojtaba Khamenei has maintained Iran's resilience throughout this entire crisis by relying on a decentralized Mosaic doctrine of defense.
The Mosaic doctrine, right.
In this strategic system, the loss of top leaders to assassinations or the destruction of physical infrastructure doesn't stop the rank-and-file fighters. The missile cities and local commanders operate autonomously. They don't need orders from the top to keep fighting. Contrast that Mosaic doctrine with the hyper-centralized, top-heavy U.S. command structure, which currently seems utterly paralyzed by internal intelligence dissent, rigid bureaucratic thinking, and an obsessive need for absolute top-down control. So the ultimate question is this: who breaks first? The decentralized network fighting a perceived existential war for survival in their own homeland, or the highly centralized empire fighting a fractured war of choice for $200 billion.
If you found this analysis valuable, hit the plus or follow button on your podcast app and give us a like. Subscribe to the Hot News channel for more deep dives. Until we meet again, goodbye.